In the previous lecture, we introduced utilitarianism, and we saw how Bentham's hedonic calculus worked for assigning scores to each action for the purpose of, in principle, deciding what to do. In this lecture, I want to unpack utilitarianism a bit more by breaking it down into three components, all of which are signed up to by utilitarianism, at least as it's normally understood by moral philosophers, but which are in fact logically independent of one another. And there are many philosophers who will believe some of these components, but not others. So here are three questions that are logically distinct from each other. The first question is the question of well-being. So this is the question of what makes it the case that a person's life goes well for that person to the extent that it does go well for her? What makes for well-being for an individual? Here, the utilitarian characteristically gives the answer that hedonism is the correct account of individual well-being. That is to say, pleasures and pains, happiness and unhappiness are the only thing that matter for the well-being of an individual. So that's component one. The second question, which is distinct, is how should we aggregate across individuals? So suppose that you decided which theory of well-being you believe. So you've decided how in principle you might assign scores to each possible life a person might lead to measure how well or badly that life is going for the person in question. There's still a question of, once you've done that for every individual in the society, how well are things going overall? So how does the well-being of each individual in the society combine to determine an overall index of how good is the state of affairs in which those people live those lives? So that's part of that is the question of aggregation, and the utilitarian's characteristic answer is that you arrive at an index of the overall goodness of a state of affairs by adding up the well-being levels of all the people, or more generally, all the sentient creatures, animals matter too, that exist in that state of affairs. And then thirdly, we have the question of what's the correct criterion of right action? So far, at least in question 2, we just talked about how good is the state of affairs that might result from a given action. It doesn't immediately follow what you ought to do. So there's a non-trivial question about what's the connection between how good is a state of affairs on the one hand and what ought one to do, which actions are morally right and wrong, where do our duties lie, those deontic questions on the other hand. And at least as it's usually understood by contemporary philosophers, utilitarianism here is committed to a consequentialist answer, where the right thing to do is the thing that would lead to the best possible state of affairs. So in the rest of this lecture and in some subsequent lectures, I'll unpack especially the first and the third of those questions in more detail to explain more how the utilitarian is thinking about this picture, and in some cases what the alternative answers might look like and why some people don't agree with the utilitarian points of view on those questions. So first, let's dig into hedonism a little bit more. So we've seen that hedonism, along with utilitarianism, says that how well your life goes is a matter of how happy your life is. How much happiness and unhappiness, how many pleasures, how many pains, how strong are the pleasures and pains that you have in your life. And this can be understood in terms of intensity and duration, as we said in the previous lecture. But when we want to understand more what that looks like in concrete terms, we might want to think more about what kinds of things actually count as pleasures, what sort of things will be included in this hedonic calculus. And in particular, it can be useful to distinguish between what sometimes get called lower pleasures on the one hand and higher pleasures on the other hand. So the lower pleasures here would be the sort of simple physical sensations. So think of things like the pleasure of relaxing in a warm bath, the pleasure of eating a good meal, perhaps the pleasure of drinking alcohol if you find that pleasurable, the pleasure of that endorphin rush that you might get from vigorous exercise. So those are sort of physical pleasures, and sometimes those get called of as being lower pleasures. The reason for calling them lower pleasures, if you think of a life that contains only those pleasures, you might feel like there's something missing. There's some more advanced pleasures that you might want that wouldn't be contained in a life that only had those simple physical pleasures. And in particular, people are often interested here in more intellectualized pleasures. So think of things like, if you're somebody who appreciates mathematics, that sort of special satisfaction and appreciation of elegance and beauty that you get when you understand a sublime mathematical theorem for the first time, or read a great work of philosophy, or an amazing poem, or you see a wonderful play, those sort of more intellectualized experiences, maybe appreciating wonderful architecture, this sort of thing. So those sort of things would be called higher pleasures. Utilitarianism is occasionally been accused of being a doctrine worthy only of swine. But this, as Mill says, this is really a misunderstanding of utilitarianism. The place that objection comes from is from thinking that when utilitarians say pleasure, they must only mean those lower pleasures, those kind of pleasures that even pigs could get to enjoy. Whereas that point of view would, of course, miss out these sort of higher sensations that we advanced humans are capable of. Utilitarians are going to say, no, no, it's not a doctrine worthy only of swine. If you think that, you misunderstand my position. I want to count the higher pleasures too. Those things are also pleasurable. So both Bentham and Mill would agree with the thing I just said, that utilitarianism is not a doctrine worthy of swine because we're going to count what I've here been calling higher pleasures as well as counting the lower pleasures. We count the intellectual satisfactions and the aesthetic experiences as well as the simple physical pleasures. However, there's a further question regarding the relation between these higher and lower pleasures that Bentham and Mill disagree with one another on. And that's the question of whether there's any deep sense in which the higher pleasures are somehow superior to the lower pleasures. So here Bentham is going to say no, they're not superior, whereas Mill is going to say yes, they are superior. So for Bentham, the picture is, okay, if you're comparing an action that would lead to somebody having a pleasurable experience of relaxing in a warm bath on the one hand, with an action that would instead lead to somebody having a pleasurable experience of appreciating a sublime theorem of mathematics on the other hand, all you need to know is what's the quantity of pleasure involved. And for Bentham, it might turn out that the quantity of pleasure involved in the warm bath, if it's a particularly great bath, might exceed the quantity of pleasure that's involved in a mathematical theorem, if it's not that great a theorem, or if the person appreciating it isn't that keen on mathematics. So Bentham famously said something like, prejudice apart, the game of pushpin, so some kind of simple parlour game that children used to play in his time, prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. If the game of pushpin furnish more pleasure, then it is more valuable than either. So that's Bentham expressing the point of view that all we need to know is what's the quantity of pleasure that's involved. So Mill disagrees with that. He thinks that this point of view is missing something, and Mill is more pro the so-called higher pleasures. So Mill says, anybody who's experienced both kinds of pleasure, what I've been provisionally calling the higher pleasures and the lower pleasures, if they're given a choice between one or the other, they're always going to choose the higher pleasure over the lower pleasure, regardless of quantity. Mill thinks they're always going to choose a little bit of appreciation of mathematics or architecture or poetry over any number of warm baths. And Mill thinks this is the so-called test of the competent judges. People who've experienced both things will always choose the so-called higher thing, and that shows that the higher thing really is better, regardless of quantity. If you want to get into the frame of mind of thinking, as Mill did here, you might consider a thought experiment proposed by the contemporary moral philosopher Roger Chris, where he invites you to consider that you're a soul in heaven waiting to be assigned a life. You're going to get to live whichever life you choose, and the angel in heaven is offering you a choice between two lives. You either get to be the famous composer Joseph Haydn, or you get to be an oyster. If you choose to be Haydn, you get this great life, you become a famous composer, you love your work is appreciated in your own lifetime, you enjoy being famous, you have great family, great friends, everything goes well for you by all the normal standards of human life. And it's also quite a long life as human lives go. You only die when you're 77 years old, so you get a good innings. So that's life number one. Life number two is the life of an oyster, and Crisp invites us to imagine that while this oyster has a pleasurable life as oyster lives go, it's only a kind of mild pleasure akin to the pleasure that a human might get from relaxing while drunk in a mildly warm bath. But the important thing is this oyster life can be as long as you want. If you want to make it 1,000,000 years long, 1,000,000,000 years long, 1,000,000,000,000 years long, make it as long as you like. The question is there any length of that oyster life that would lead you to prefer the oyster life over living the life of Joseph Haydn? And the point of the thought experiment is most of us are going to say no, or at least Crisp invites us to consider whether we're going to say no. I don't think I'd choose the oyster, regardless of how many trillions of years I got to live as an oyster. I would rather be Joseph Haydn. And that seems to indicate that I at least think Mill is correct. There is this sense in which higher pleasures are intrinsically superior to lower pleasures. No amount of quantity of the oyster pleasure would lead me to prefer that over the Joseph Haydn pleasure. So to sum up what we've said in this lecture, we can distinguish between what some people call higher and lower pleasures, the basic physical sensations, and the more advanced, if you like, intellectual pleasures. All utilitarians are going to agree that both of these things matter, but utilitarians, and in particular Bentham and Mill, disagree amongst themselves about the relation between the two, and in particular, whether the so-called higher pleasures are intrinsically superior to the lower ones.